Welcome back, everybody. Today we're looking at Chapter 16, Section 4, The Republican Party Emerges. And with that, we'll be answering this question: why was the Republican Party founded, and how did Abraham Lincoln become a leader so quickly? So we're going to be looking at how the Republican Party was formed, the groups that it came out of, the focus of the party, as well as some other things going on in the country during this time that the Republican Party is being formed. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so if you want to use the audio recording, the picture associated with each section of the audio recording today is of the Republican elephant. But if not, let us continue on and take a look at the key terms for today. And our key terms are Republican Party, arsenal, treason, and martyr. Those last three will be in the second section of today, but first we're going to focus primarily on the Republican Party and on one person in particular. That's right. Today we're going to be talking about one of my personal heroes from American history, Mr. Abraham Lincoln. And at this point in our nation, Mr. Lincoln had not yet been elected president or emancipated the slaves. At this point, he was just a lawyer from Illinois and still very, very new to politics. And the party he represented, the Republican Party, was still in its very first years of existence as well. So to the American public, this man was a strange leader from a basically unknown political party. And Lincoln knew that eventually the issue of slavery had the potential of tearing the country apart, and he wanted to try and avoid that at all costs. But sometimes, in order to do what is right, you have to be willing to stand up and take responsibility for the tough decisions. So today we're going to look at some of the things that happened in Lincoln's past that helped shape him into the man that would eventually become the 16th President of the United States. But first, let's look at the Republican Party as a whole and how it got its start. So by the mid-1850s, those who opposed slavery felt that they really didn't have a strong enough voice in government. There was not a political party that hadn't compromised in one way or another with slave states, and neither the Whigs nor the Democrats, the two main political parties at this time, neither one would really take a stand against slavery. So a group of Free Soil Party members, Northern Democrats, and anti-slavery Whigs gathered in Michigan in 1854 to form the Republican Party. And the main goal of the party was to keep slavery out of the Western territories, kind of in line with the Free Soil. Some of the Republicans, some that joined the Republican Party, were abolitionists, but most of the people that comprised the party simply wanted to stop the spread of slavery. Again, the main goal of the Republican Party at first was to keep slavery out of the Western territories. So, formed in 1854 from a group of Free Soilers, Northern Democrats, and anti-slavery Whigs. And this new party grew very quickly, and by 1856 they nominated John C. Fremont for President of the United States. And Fremont was chosen because he had fought for California's independence, and he was opposed to the spread of slavery, despite having very little political experience. So he was a war hero, and he was opposed to the spread of slavery, which fell right in line with the goal of the Republican Party. So running against him was James Buchanan, a Democrat from Pennsylvania. Buchanan was a Northern Democrat, but held to Southern principles, so he appealed more to the South. And running against them as well was former President Millard Fillmore, and he was running for the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party. And He ran because he was afraid that if the Republicans won, it would split the nation apart. So, as we can see from the map, Buchanan ended up winning, but the Republicans, even though they were a very young political party, made a very strong showing. Now, Fremont, it's interesting to note, looking at this map, that Fremont did not win a single southern state, but still ended up with a third of the popular vote. And seeing this made more Southerners afraid that their role in the federal government was fading away, and eventually they would be left helpless. And our next video is going to talk about the formation and the emergence of the Republican Party in a little bit more detail. And we'll pick up after that talking about our good buddy Abraham Lincoln.
It is against this backdrop that the country approaches the presidential election of 1856. Democratic Party leaders, looking for a candidate who cannot be linked to Bleeding Kansas, nominate James Buchanan, a party regular who was in England during the crisis. The newly formed Republican Party nominates John Fremont, who gained fame as the man who mapped the Oregon Trail.
Young, ambitious former Whigs like Abraham Lincoln, like Salmon Chase, like Joshua Giddings, like Charles Sumner, joined the Republican Party because it took the economic program of the Whigs and wedded it to anti-slavery principles when it came to slavery in the territories. And as it turned out, Fremont did very well in a three-way race, which Buchanan won. And the thing about the Republican Party that most students of American history tend to forget is that it was the first party ever in American history to arise out of a purely sectional issue. So it was a Northern party, identified with Northern leaders, appealing to the Northern electorate, with no base at all in the Southern party.
And it would be Abraham Lincoln that would bring the next test for the Republican Party in 1858 by challenging Stephen Douglas for his seat in Senate. Lincoln had come from humble beginnings. He had been born in Kentucky on the frontier, but soon his family moved to Indiana and eventually to Illinois in search of better land and better opportunities. We've talked about him in the past, and we know that he only attended formal schooling for 1 year, but had taught himself to read by firelight. And once he left home, he worked several jobs until he was able to start a career in politics. He served 8 years in the state legislature and 1 term in Congress, which brings us up to 1858. And the test that I was referring to that Lincoln brought for the Republican Party was in reference to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And as a refresher, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was an 1854 law that established the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and gave settlers the right of popular sovereignty to decide on the issue of slavery. Now, Lincoln was very, very bitterly opposed to it, so he challenged the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas, for his seat in Senate. During the campaign, Lincoln and Douglas had a series of 7 debates, with the main issue of those debates being slavery. Douglas actually personally disliked slavery, but he believed that the issue should be settled based on popular sovereignty, and it should be up to the territories really to decide for themselves. It wasn't for him to decide. That he believed that people should have the right to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. Personally, he disliked slavery, but he felt that people should be able to decide for themselves. Lincoln didn't believe in complete equality between black and white Americans, but he did see slavery as being a moral wrong. And Lincoln argued that since slavery was a, quote, moral, social, and political wrong, it shouldn't be treated as an issue that can just be voted on in the territories. He wasn't a total abolitionist. He wasn't an immediate abolitionist at this time. At this point, he just wanted to stop the spread of slavery, but didn't really want to mess with slavery where it already existed in the South. Let me repeat. At this time, Lincoln just wanted to stop the spread of slavery, so gradual abolitionist. He didn't want to mess with it where it already existed in the South. And so that was the main focus of these debates, that slavery should not be allowed to spread into the West, and that the Kansas-Nebraska Acts should be repealed. So this campaign went on for weeks, with each man speaking to very large crowds every day. And at the end of the election, Douglas won, but only by a very slim margin. But what this did for Lincoln is that his words inspired Northerners to view slavery as a moral evil, not something that should just be voted on in the territories. And the campaign also made Lincoln a nationally known figure, which was going to help in 2 years when he ran for the office of president.
In 1858, the year after the Dred Scott decision was issued, Minnesota entered the Union as a free state. Gold was discovered in Colorado, and the Butterfield Overland Stage Line began to operate a regular stagecoach service between Missouri and California, and the journey took 3 weeks. 1858 was also the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates over slavery that took place during the race for the U.S. Senate in Illinois. On one side was the Democratic candidate for senator, Stephen Douglas. On the opposing side was Abraham Lincoln, the Republican senatorial candidate. Lincoln was opposed to slavery on the grounds that it was a great moral evil. Lincoln tried to convince voters that Stephen Douglas was not to be trusted because he was the man behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act that had made slavery possible in territories where it had been previously illegal. Douglas believed that American citizens should be free to decide if they wanted to have slavery without having government interference. He warned that Lincoln's ideas on racial equality were dangerous and misguided. In the end, Lincoln's moral stand against slavery brought him to the attention of the entire nation, but even at that, Douglas won the race for senator.
But before Lincoln's campaign for President of the United States, there was going to be more violence over slavery that would increase the divisions between the North and the South. Remember, yesterday we talked about John Brown and his raids in the Kansas Territory. Well, that raid in Kansas was not the end of his campaign against slavery. He led a group that included 5 African Americans and members of his family and friends to the town of Harpers Ferry, Virginia in 1859. Now, Brown planned to raid a federal arsenal, or a gun warehouse, and use those guns to arm slaves and help them to lead a revolt. And Brown was successful to a point. He was able to gain control of the arsenal, but there wasn't the mass slave uprising that he had expected. He had captured the arsenal pretty easily, but it really didn't do anything to inspire a revolt. Furthermore, Harpers Ferry didn't really have that many slaves to begin with. So he captures the arsenal, and then eventually a group of 12 Marines led by Robert E. Lee killed 10 of Brown's raiders and captured Brown. And during his trial, Brown sat quietly as he was found guilty of murder and of treason. But because he conducted himself with dignity, he became a hero of many Northerners and was even seen as a martyr because he was willing to lay down his life for his beliefs. And the morning that he was hanged, many churches in the North rang solemnly, and many sang his praises for years and years to come. In the South, however, Brown was a traitor, and the fact that Northerners would sing his praises was an outrage. He had tried to lead a slave revolt, and many more Southerners became convinced that everyone in the North wanted to destroy slavery and wanted to destroy their way of life. And soon this was going to lead to one of the bloodiest times in American history. And this painting that we're looking at is called The Last Moments of John Brown. And what do you think that the artist was trying to say with this painting?
In 1859, as candidate Lincoln warned that a house divided against itself cannot stand, the national debate on slavery escalated into preparation for war. Americans on both sides openly prayed for vindication. For those enslaved, the answer to prayer continued to come in the burst of courage that enabled them to flee north. For religious crusader John Brown, it came in the form of a fateful decision to fuse an uprising that would once and for all put an end to the ungodly institution of slavery. His forces established, Brown intended to use the Underground Railroad for his supply line.
Interestingly, John Brown had come to Philadelphia to seek support of the African American community, and Still was one of 3 who attended a meeting with John Brown, and Still was not enthused about it. He was concerned that any provocative action like this, John Brown was trying to provoke a slave uprising, that this kind of action would endanger the Underground Railroad.
In the early hours of October 16, 1859, John Brown and his small provisional army of the United States seized control of the armory at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Federal troops from neighboring states quickly arrived. By the next morning, 12 Marines, led by Robert E. Lee, broke into the armory and took the badly injured Brown and his raiders into captivity.
And in his papers was a note, wrote today to William Still. Many people encouraged Still to flee the country temporarily. Harriet Tubman was sent to Canada during this period to put her out of harm's way because John Brown had met with her. And that Still did not flee. And in fact, some of the men who had helped Brown came through Philadelphia and were hidden by Still and Letitia in their home. So even though he thought this was a bad idea, he risked his life and his family to protect some of the men who had participated in the raid.
Before being hanged on December 2nd in Charlestown, a resolute Brown stated, "You may dispose of me very easily. I am nearly disposed of now. But this question is still to be settled. The Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet."
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, in a speech given on June 16, 1858, Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Do you agree that slavery was too important an issue to allow differences between the states? For your assignment today, I want you to take the phrase, "cannot endure permanently half slave and half free," and analyze it. And by analyze it, I mean I'm asking you to describe what was happening in the United States at this time period, and then describe what Mr. Lincoln said by and meant by that phrase. Do you believe that he was correct when he said that the country could not continue half slave and half free? Or do you think the country could have survived half slave, half free? So you're going to write this up in a paragraph explaining the reason for your position, and this will be worth 15 points. You will be graded on your position and on your ability to defend that position. And in your defense, you must provide details from the text and or the lesson or outside sources to help you support your position. If you believe the country could have survived, then show evidence that it could have survived. If you agree with Mr. Lincoln that the country would not be able to remain divided, then provide evidence to support that. And at the bottom of this page, if you would like, the rest of Mr. Lincoln's speech is in this book at the very bottom of our page. So if you want to continue reading through the speech in its entirety, it's fairly long, but it's very, very well written. So that is up to you. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, you know where to find me.